Hello, this is the Thrive YouTube channel with Dr. Lee Hildebrand, where I'm looking to help you find ways in your lives, in your careers, and many other venues in which you can thrive and continue to grow. Today's topic, I would really like to take a look at an approach to trauma healing that's gaining increasing attention, and that's somatic or body-based therapy. So this is going to be a video on healing through the body, the origins of somatic approaches to trauma. Now, many of us associate trauma therapy with talk therapy, but for decades, researchers and clinicians have recognized that trauma really lives not just in our thoughts, but in our bodies. In this talk, I'd really like to explore how these approaches to trauma healing have emerged in regard to giving more credence to the impact of how trauma impacts our bodies versus not just our minds. Now, in the early understandings of trauma, before somatic approaches, trauma was mainly understood through a psychological lens. In fact, after World War I, doctors often spoke of trauma in regard to a term called shell shock. And it was a term used to describe the overwhelming psychological breakdown of soldiers in combat. Later on, during and after the Vietnam War, this concept developed of post-traumatic stress disorder. In other words, the short version, PTSD. This was formally recognized in about 1980 by the American Psychiatric Association. And this is the point at which we really started to gain some further traction in understanding trauma. Now, traditional therapy in regard to the treatment of PTSD often focused on cognition. That is, changing thought patterns and processing memories. But many people found, even after years of talking, that they still felt dysregulated in their bodies, they felt anxiety, and they felt very disconnected. This continued to raise an important question for both clinicians and researchers. What if trauma is stored not just in the mind, but in the nervous system itself? So at this point, there began to emerge somatic approaches, and the question shifted to more a body-oriented revolution in terms of trauma focus. Now, one of the pioneers of this was William Reich, who was around till about 1957, and he was an early psychoanalyst and student of Freud. And Reich was among the first to suggest that emotional trauma was held in our bodies in a muscular form. He coined the term body armor, which is like this chronic muscular tension that people with PTSD or trauma often experience as a defense mechanism. Though controversial in his time, this concept that Reich developed and this emphasis on the body really laid a groundwork for future somatic therapies. Alexander Lowen in energetics, developed a system which combines physical exercises and breath work and some expressive movements that can lead to a process of releasing trauma. So this theory about the body having something to do with the trauma continued to develop further. And he also emphasized how the body reflects personality and our emotional history. Then comes along Peter Levine in the 1970s, who looked at what's called somatic re-experiencing, or somatic experiencing. And Levine was a biophysicist and a psychologist that developed this approach of somatic experience. And he studied this in animals at first in the wild. And what he noticed with animals is after a life-threatening situation, that animals do not develop PTSD. And this really led him to explore the question of why. And over time, his insight was that animals complete a whole fight or flight freeze response, which often includes shaking or trembling, to discharge energy from a traumatic situation. And therefore, they wouldn't necessarily have PTSD as many humans do when they experience trauma. So, in this somatic experiencing approach, Levine has focused with clients in terms of an approach to tracking their bodily sensations and as it's associated with trauma, and finding ways to release the stored, what he calls survival energy. In fact, he wrote a book in 1997 called Waking the Tiger, which has become a foundational text for his movement. Please feel free to check that out. Now, moving forward, there was another groundbreaking book done by Bessel van der Kolk called The Body Keeps the Score. This is very popular even now in regard to this movement toward looking at the way the body stores trauma. Now, van der Kolk is a psychiatrist and researcher, and he shows through neuroscience and clinical work how trauma changes the brain and the body. In fact, he popularized this idea that the body keeps the score, even if the conscious mind forgets or rationalizes what occurred in the trauma. Now, he has often claimed that when somebody is experiencing trauma, and in his book he talks in depth about this, that they have a hard time finding language for the trauma. And he surmises that part of this is that trauma resonates more in the right brain, the nonverbal part of the brain, than it does in the left brain, which is the more verbal part. This is why you see in traumatic situations that people really have a hard time describing or talking about the situation. Sometimes they don't even have words. Sometimes they strongly disassociate from situations and literally have physical symptoms, whether it be pain or certain tensions in their body. This can oftentimes lead to health situations as well. So he's supportive of approaches to this, and in particular, he talks about yoga as a very helpful approach to releasing some of this stress in terms of the body. He also is an advocate of both EMDR and other types of movement therapies. Now, from these pioneers, there's a few core ideas that are beginning to emerge in the field of psychology and trauma treatment. One is that trauma is physiological. It's not just psychological. That the nervous system itself holds trauma. That the body, as van der Kolk said, it keeps the score. It holds in the trauma. And I've personally, in my work as a psychologist, seen situations where people literally in a certain part of their body have a certain tension, or if they touch that part of their body or start to think about that part of their body, it will evoke emotions. I've had situations where people have teared up in regard to this kind of focus. In addition, the body needs to be complete in terms of interrupting the stress response. So how you can interrupt the stress response is through movement. Breath work can be very helpful in regard to this, and also sensation tracking in terms of having an overall awareness of where stress is in your body when you're experiencing this stress, particularly as it relates to trauma. In addition to that, there can be physical grounding or physical touch that can help to release and to activate those parts of the body where there's trauma stress that's being held. So whether this is through movement or breath or the sensation tracking, the goal is to allow the body to do what it couldn't do during the traumatic event, and that is to release the physiological aspects and the stress of the trauma. In addition to that, there's some somatic work that can proceed with a client in helping them slowly and helping them to stay within a window of tolerance as they're addressing this trauma. In other words, you don't want to make things too stressful for the person when you're trying to help them with this. You don't want them to be overwhelmed. You want them to continue to be able to be engaged. The body awareness is part of the healing too, in terms of a person beginning to become more accustomed to how it feels to be in their body, to what their body feels like and how it interconnects with their emotions. There are many fields outside of psychology and many areas that are indicating that this is really important, and that the bodies themselves and just even physical touch is a really important part of healing for people. In fact, there was a very large study that was released, I believe, in February of 2025 that looked across the whole medical span in regard to the power of touch for healing in regard to these issues. So in a world with trauma that often tells us, hey, just get over it, or aren't you over that yet? Somatic trauma healing offers us a slightly different viewpoint than just the cognitive. It's a way to listen to the body's signals, to reclaim a sense of agency, and to allow healing from trauma at a pace that a person is comfortable with. It reminds us that we are not broken, that our bodies have done us a favor. They've done the best they can to protect us. Sometimes they protect us by holding in these aspects of trauma so it doesn't overwhelm us. In other ways, sometimes our body will literally disassociate, our mind and our body disassociates from a present traumatic situation in a protective stance, especially in children, in order not to experience the full weight of the trauma. And the body can often be a conduit in which we can find insight into what's been disassociated in regard to the trauma. So as more therapists in the field of psychology and educators and communities continue to learn more about trauma and how the body and the physiology, the somatic part, has such an important role, this is going to continue to help us as a healing community in how to help people who experience trauma. Some of you that are listening to this may have already experienced some kind of traumatic experience that has led to some PTSD, etc. And I just want to offer that there is hope for healing. And there's a number of different modalities that approach this. I didn't get into all of the cognitive ones, including exposure, including cognitive processing therapy, just due to time today. But it is important to note that there's a whole new realm to this that's developed over time that is not leaving out the physiology of trauma healing in the way that the body is so interconnected with the mind and the emotions. This can be an important path of healing for you that can be helpful. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me if you feel like this could be a helpful pathway for you in regard to trauma healing. And obviously there's many resources out there. I highly recommend the books that I've referenced, and in particular the one by Bessel van der Kolk called The Body Keeps the Score. His last name is Vander, Vander, and capital COLK, if you want to reference that. So I hope you found this brief overview helpful to you, whether it's just intellectual curiosity or it directly relates to some things that you've gone into in your life. And maybe some of you have tried cognitive therapy and found it to be wanting in regard to trying to get the help and the release that you need. So I'm wishing you well. I hope that you find your own ways to thrive today, and I'll look forward to offering you more material on this YouTube channel that can be helpful toward that end, and that is for you to thrive. Thank you so much.